How influential were movies, films at the beginning of the 20th century in shaping public opinion, in framing political and social debates, and in introducing issues to a wide public that otherwise would not have been aware of those very problems? Well, they were enormously influential. The medium allowed the director to communicate a message immediately without filters. From the point of view of the audience had no barriers. The audience was not required to read and interpret the way it happens with newspapers. They were not even required to look at a cartoon, for instance, and decipher the metaphor that's present in the cartoon. And there was no radio at the time. So the only form of dynamic narration in those days came from the movies. The audience also, let's remember, the way it is right now, entered in a dark room, a dark environment, which is already suggestive and then tends to put people in a certain mood that allows for a message to penetrate much more directly. It is a very seductive kind of environment. I'm not going to go into psychoanalytic theory about cinema, the film, the perception and how we process it, but we know that it is much more powerful than any other medium that conveys a message. Now, we saw with the Black Hand and the skyscrapers of New York that political messages, social messages, definitely went through from the producer to the audience. The films were used for that purpose. And what kind of representation of Italians did they provide? A very negative one. The first one that everybody noticed was the issue of violence. Do you remember? There was a kidnapping, then there were fights, there was a frame-up in skyscrapers of Italy. There was the other issue of untrustworthy. So not just violence and criminal activity, but the fact that these Italians were sneaky, that you could not trust them, that they were dangerous, they were bringing into our society elements of corruption that could ruin, that could erode the bounds of trust in our society. Well, among the other things, if you want to go further into the analysis, there is the notion of laziness, the loafers, the two people in the Black Hand that are drinking wine, blah, blah, blah. But also the extreme case of kidnapping a child. So it is, maybe we are not attuned to what the reaction of the audience back then must have been, but the concept itself that you victimize a child for something like that must have been horrendously scary and repulsive to the audience. Okay. The most influential movie of the time was not about Italian Americans, it was about African Americans. D.W. Griffith in 1915 produced, directed the film A Birth of a Nation. This movie was a mega hit. It was the biggest hit up to that point. Everybody saw it. And what it did was to present African Americans in a very negative light. The context was that of the Civil War, and the perspective was that of the Confederates. There is a storyline within the context, as I said, of the Civil War. We'll see about 4 minutes, but it is probably the most salient clip of the entire movie. And then we will see how these individuals are represented. Now, why in this time, is this movie coming out at this time? Well, because it represented themes and ideas and debates that were discussed very intensely in these particular times. After the end of the Civil War, slaves had been emancipated, and for all intents and purposes, they really had same rights as white people. The white establishment in society was under shock after the loss, disorganized, there was no real leadership, everything from their point of view was lost. So they couldn't reorganize and launch a counter-offensive for at least 30-40 years. But then they started pushing back on the process of integration of African Americans into white society. How did they do that? Well, they found loopholes in the laws. So there was this famous, very controversial Supreme Court verdict that that embraced the concept of separate but equal. The separate but equal principle, I think it was the Ferguson decision, is a stain on the honor of this country and on the Constitution. And it took forever before it was repudiated by another Supreme Court decision. Actually, it was Brown versus Board of Education that you must have heard, I hope, in the 50s, which allowed access to schools to African Americans, basically stopped the segregation of schools. All painful, very painful period, this one. This is the period that we saw briefly in Salvetti, is drenched in the blood of lynchings. 34 Italian over probably something like 5,000 African Americans. And if you say, well, 5,000 African Americans, that doesn't sound that much, right? It's only 5,000. Well, think about one lynching a day for 12 years, every single day. That brings you up to 5,000 approximately. So all of these things happen at the same time, and here we must find a rationale why we are doing these things. How do we convince people that we are in the right? You can be racist, but you can't simply express. You must have arguments to support your racist position. And this movie helps shaping the debate. This is what African Americans are like. They're lazy, they're cowardly, they are dangerous, there is a hint of a possible rape, and despite this fact, despite the fact that they are morally unacceptable at all levels, well, they want to vote. And this we will not allow. Segregation, apartheid, discrimination, yes, those were the tools, but the final goal, the political goal of the entire machinery, the entire process, was to prevent African Americans from voting. And not coincidentally, This clip shows exactly that. Yes, so you saw that in that period, the Ku Klux Klan was the savior. That salvation came from the activities of the Ku Klux Klan against the African Americans. I wouldn't use the term that they used to describe them. Now, aside from the very obvious content, blatant content, here it is the first moment where I want you to focus on the concept of representation versus self-representation. Look at the cartoons, the Black Hand, and Skyscrapers of New York. That is the representation of Italians, Italian Americans, that is coming from the majority of what we call the entitled class. Italians were a subordinate class, and the dominant class, the white Anglo-Saxon culture, represented them in a specific way. If we look at Pascal's Son of Italy, we have instead self-representation. And the two are dramatically different. If we look at the reason why I bring up a lot the experience of African Americans, it's because it is the most extreme in our country. And I really use it as a benchmark to measure all other forms of discrimination that never reached the level of what African Americans had to endure during slavery, but in a more diffused nationwide terms during primarily the Jim Crow's laws period, all the way for sure to the civil rights movement, and even after that, and even today, I would say. Now, it is quite interesting because the 1915, 1920, it is when the Ku Klux Klan is beginning to gather force in the South, to the point where an active member, an active leader of the Klan is eventually elected governor, and not of a southern state, but governor of Indiana. The Ku Klux Klan had reached up into the highest level of state politics, and several members of the Klan also became senators and representatives. One of them was, I forgot his first name, Byrd. He was a senator from West Virginia for, I don't know, 50, 60 years. And yeah, at the beginning of his career, he was still a member of the Klan. Robert Byrd, I think. Anyways, this is what I want to introduce. It is the notion of representation and self-representation. If we look at one particular moment in this film that to me is still shocking, because 100 years later we are still dealing with the same problem, it is vote suppression. You saw at the very end that with weapons and with intimidation, they are going to prevent African Americans from voting. If you follow even minimally the debate that is going on and the real issues that are going on in this country that prevent democracy to be applied and prevent the true rules of democracy from governing our country, then you'll see that repressing the vote of minorities is still probably one of the most important and most effective weapons that are used by, well, those who have an interest in preventing minorities from voting. I'm going to stop here.